Genesis 16, 1 through 16. Again, we are not reading the scripture at the beginning of this. We'll just jump straight in. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. But she had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." So let's go down to the bottom and open up with our plot line. And the action begins quite quickly. In verse 1, this is all kind of introductory. Sarai is barren. Remember also, we'll know here in a second, but that they've been in the land of Israel for about 10 to 11 years at this point. So that means that Sarai has known the promise that God has given Abraham that he's going to have an offspring. And 10, 11 years later, Sarai is still barren. She's getting on in years. She's not getting any younger, and still no baby. The second verse up here. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. This is the introductory comment. The next sentence begins, but, right? This means that Sarai has no options for children, but she does have a second option, right? So option 1 isn't working out, but option 2 hasn't been tried yet. She does have an Egyptian slave. Remember that in Egypt they had acquired slaves, and apparently one of them was by the name of Hagar. Hagar, belongs to Sarai. So, right, now she's got options, a second option, if you will. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children." So having no children, she directly attributes to the Lord. The Lord has kept me from having children. I'm in this spot because of God. And so she comes up with her own plan, right? This is Sarai's plan. And she's doing it in spite of God. She believes that the Lord has kept her from having children. So she gives a command: go sleep with my slave. That's the command she gives to Abram. Perhaps I can build a family through her. And so this phrase here, "I can build a family," is interesting. Other translations would say that I can have a son through her. But it is the verb build. And so it's just an ironic reversal that the Egyptians will build through the Israelites later. But her plan right now is to build through the Egyptian slave, Hagar. It's just an interesting reversal. So let's go back down to the bottom. And we get verse 2. Sarai's plan. And in that, there's like quite a few lessons for us about control and trusting God with plans versus trying to control. Control and trust are often opposed to one another. That's what makes life difficult in living it by faith. So she gives this command, right, to her husband. And the next verse tells us that Abram agreed to what Sarai had said. The literal would be Abram listened to his wife's voice. And this construction is important because it appears in only one other place, and there's in Genesis chapter 3 with Adam, who listened to his wife's voice, Eve. And what we're going to see in what follows is a story that parallels the fall in Genesis chapter 3. Abram listens to his wife, Sarai, "Go sleep with my slave." So, after Abram had been living in Canaan for 10 years, so now we know it's been 10 years, boom. Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave, Hagar, and gave her to her husband to be his wife. So look at what that says. Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave, Hagar, and gave her to her husband, right? Again, back to the garden when Eve gives, she takes the fruit and she gives some to her husband. So Hagar here is in many ways the fruit of the Garden of Eden. Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife, right? Sarai is making Hagar into the wife of Abram. And in that way, Abram has legitimate heirs, but also because she is Sarai's slave, Sarai now can build her own family, build her family through her slave Hagar. He slept with Hagar and she conceived. And so in this, we see that it was certainly Sarai who was barren and not Abram who was shooting blanks, if you will. So we'll go to verses now down at the bottom here, 3 and 4. I'm going to move this over here. So boom, Sarai's plan. And then in verses 3 through 4, what happens is Abram, more directly, we could say Abram sleeps with Hagar. But let's not forget that here Abram becomes like Adam. He does not do what he's supposed to do. He does not act the role of the lead male. He does not protect his wife. He doesn't protect his household. He doesn't trust God. He just listens to his wife's plan. And obviously, terrible things will take place as a result. We'll go back up to the top. Verse picking up in verse 4. When she knew she was pregnant, this is she being Hagar here. When Hagar knew that she was pregnant, Hagar, again, began to despise her mistress. So she's been elevated, right? Elevated to wife, and now pregnant. And so she begins to despise her mistress. It's important to understand here that elevated to wife and pregnant does not mean that she's not a slave. She is still a slave. But now that she's been elevated to wife and pregnant, she begins to despise her master, her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, you are responsible. So like this leads to just a natural evolution here. You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. Sorry, I shouldn't laugh. Sarai's plan, right? And she blames it on her husband. What's funny is that she's blaming, but what's also funny is that it's true. Abram should not have gone along with the plan. So Abram does have fault because he's the leader here, but she is wrong in just blaming him, right? So let's look what happens. You're responsible for the wrong I am suffering. It's your fault that Hagar is mistreating me. I put my slave in your arms. This is literally bosom. And so the idea here might be that Abram is beginning to treat Hagar well. And, right, in addition to this, now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. She looks down on me. May the Lord judge between you and me. Sarai is at least telling herself, I am innocent, right? And in this way, she is very much like Eve, who, when she gets in trouble, blames the serpent. And Sarai here is absolving herself of guilt. She's blaming her husband. And she says, may the Lord judge between you and me. And we just have to be careful with this because we can say things like this. And often we need to not forget that God does indeed judge between us. So let's go down to the bottom real quick. The next part of verse 4 is that Hagar begins to despise Sarai, right? And then in verse 5, Sarai blames Abram and denies responsibility. And just a picture here is when we were in the garden, there was no evil in the world, so the serpent was the source of temptation. But now, in a fallen world, you don't need the serpent anymore. That brokenness just exists in the people anyway. So now, we get up to verse 6, Abram's response. What does Abram say in response to this? Your slave is in your hands, right? So what does Abram do? He says, I'm innocent. He also just kind of absolves himself of guilt. He says, hey, you just do whatever with her you think is best. After all, you're her master. That's your fault that she's... So Sarai says, you're responsible for the wrong I'm suffering, right? It's your fault that Hagar is treating me badly. And Abram's saying, hey, she's your slave. It's your fault that she's treating you badly. Right? She's in your hands. You lead her, right? So it's just like the garden, Adam and Eve both denying that they're at fault. Then, and here's the problem, by the way, with human justice. Ooh, justice. What does Hagar do? Sarai mistreats Hagar. It's the same word that will be used of Egyptians and the Israelites. So Sarai treats Hagar evilly, right? So that she fled from her. Again, back to the same kind of language of Israel and the Egyptians and the Israelites. So there's a lot of foreshadowing here, right, of what's to come, but it's just been reversed. So let's go back down to the bottom. And now, verse 6, Abram denies responsibility. And so we have verses 5 and 6. Both Sarai and now Abram have denied responsibility. They've blamed each other. So there's just now lessons here in sin and blame and denial, right? When we see those same patterns show up in our lives all the time. So, Sarai mistreats Hagar, and Hagar flees. So another thing in verse 6 is, we'll go down for this one, just run out of space up top. Hagar runs away at Sarai's mistreatment. So this is consistent with the laws and the customs of the time. In societies where polygamy was normal, this is a pretty normal way of making heirs and a pretty normal way of dealing with women after they have the heir. Hagar kind of despising her mistress is pretty common. It's normal for it to happen. And so for the mistress to then mistreat the slave is also very normal. Everything that we've seen so far is normal. It's typical. Here is where it starts to get different. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. And we might ask the question right now, right? Who is this angel of the Lord? And we're going to get some interesting answers as we go through. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to shore. And he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai. This is huge, right? Sarai doesn't know who this is. And based on the conversations that to come, it's pretty obvious, or it should be obvious, at least to us, that Sarai doesn't recognize right away that this is an angel. It would seem that she thinks this is just a man. So Sarai says to the angel of the Lord, after this, let me back up. He calls Sarai slave of Hagar. So imagine that you're miles away from home, and somebody comes up to you and knows exactly who you are. That's a big deal. Where have you come from and where are you going? Now, God obviously knows the answers to these questions. And so there's just a little lesson here about when God answers a question, asks a question. It is for our benefit. God often asks questions of us, but not for his finding out. It's for our benefit. After all, he knows exactly who Sarai is. And Hagar doesn't hold anything back. She says, I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai. She answered, she's got no problem saying, my mistress, my master, is mistreating me. So verse 7 and 8. Verses 7 through 8. Hagar is met by the angel of the Lord. All right, back up. Verse 9, then, right? So she's not hiding anything from the Lord. So now the Lord's not going to hide anything from her. He says, go back, right? That's the command. Go back to your mistress and submit to her. This word submit in the Hebrew is like a kind of a rewriting of the word humiliate, right? It's to be humiliated. There is this humbling, right? This is a big deal. This is a big deal. What God is telling Hagar to do is just go back to your mistress and submit to her. This is tough. This is a tough thing to do. But then the angel added. I mean, this is almost an impossible command right here. In fact, let's go back down to the bottom and just point that out. Verse 9. We get the impossible command. Go back and submit. Ugh. Difficult when you've just ran away because you're getting beat all the time, right? And then verse 10, the angel added, here we go, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. Earlier we asked the question, who is this angel of the Lord? And now we see this, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. We discovered the angel of the Lord is in fact the Lord. Often people wonder about pre-incarnate versions of Jesus, like God appearing in human form. We have to just be careful about how much we want to push the incarnation of God in this moment. But whatever the case may be, in verses 7 and 8, it would seem that whatever Hagar saw appeared to be a normal man because she interacts with him as a normal man. In verse 10, we begin to see that this messenger isn't just a normal man, that this messenger is, in fact, the Lord. So the Lord says to her, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. And that should sound to you like the blessing promised to Abram. It's the same, right? I'm going to give you descendants like sands on the seashore. And that's what God is promising Hagar now. So let's go back down. He gave an impossible command, but then He promised great blessing. And then it reaches its climax in these next two verses, 11 through 12, right down here. The Lord said to her, you are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, which is El, right, is God. And then Ishma is about listening or hearing. Hearing. So you shall name him Ishmael, which means basically the Lord hears. And the next line, for, right? Grounding it, for the Lord has heard of your misery. Hagar, the Egyptian, God hears you, right? So Gentile kind of inclusion here. And then here's where it takes this interesting turn right here. He will be a wild donkey of a man. A wild donkey has two pieces of it. The wild means he's going to be like wandering in the desert. That's where the wild donkeys lived. But donkeys, we know, are stubborn, right? His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him, and he will live in hostility towards all his brothers. The words against, hostile, these are they're a play on words. The root word here means like to be to/against. And it doesn't have to mean in a negative, like combative sense. It could also mean that you're just like with someone or near them. But if you were to take them all together, what it means is that the descendants of Ishmael are now going to be opposed to their brothers, which will be Abram's other descendants. Now, it's important to understand here that the modern day Arabs trace themselves back to Ishmael. Ishmael also has 12 sons and 12 tribes, and the Arabs trace themselves back to Ishmael. And the Arabs are in hostility towards the Jews, who would be their brothers, right? So this prophecy has come true and remains true to this day. 11 through 12, right? So this is the kind of the climax right here, verses 11 through 12. And what is a blessing for Hagar is a curse for Israel. It's the climax of the story, but it's not the happy ending. It's a mixed bag. God has heard Hagar. God is blessing Hagar. But as he blesses Hagar, Israel just got a whole new problem. And so remember how this is like a retelling of the Garden of Eden? Well, just like God cursed Adam and Eve for their sin, that's kind of what's happening here with Hagar. God blesses Hagar and at the same time punishes Abram and Sarai for their deeds. But Abram and Sarai aren't going to experience it so much as their great-grandchildren and other descendants. And so even today, the conflict between Arabs and Israelites, it traces itself back to Sarai's mistreatment of Hagar and God's hearing of Hagar, right? So there's a lot of lessons here about how God cares for the Gentiles, how he uses them to discipline his children, and how Abram and Sarai are really in the wrong for their plan and the way that they handle it. Okay, let us continue. Verse 13. She gave this name to the Lord. And this is, by the way, the only time anyone in Scripture gives a name to God. And she calls him, "You are the God who sees me, for I have now seen the one who sees me." So God heard her with Ishmael. And she also says, "You are the God who sees me, for," she says, "I have now seen the one who sees me." This might better be constructed in a way like, have I lived after seeing the one who sees me? There's this kind of like realization that she has seen God and she's amazed by that. She's amazed that she's seen God and perhaps lived. So verse 13, Hagar names God. Big deal. And the name is that God sees me, and he absolutely does. That is why the well is called Bir Lahai Roy, which has its meaning as the well of the one who sees. It is still there between Kadesh and Bered. And I mean, this is such a cool name for the well. The God who sees me, like the God of living water sees me, right? This is just, oh man, it's so cool. Anyways, verse 14, there's a whole sermon just in that picture of God seeing us and being a well that gives us life in the desert. And that even Hagar, the Egyptian, who's going to be the godmother of all the Arabs, that is here present in this. Just insanely cool. And remember that for us, like we are very much blessed as Gentiles. And that we see that even here in the Old Testament. And then the following action here, the end of it, is that verses 15 through 16, Abram fathers Ishmael. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son. So, Hagar comes back. They say, "Hagar, what's going on?" She tells them the story, and Abram's like, "Cool, God spoke to you. We're going to name him Ishmael." Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. So now we're 11 years into the promised land. Notice that Sarai is not mentioned here. So Sarai wanted to build a house and she totally did not get to do that, right? Like, we have to not try to make God's promises happen for ourselves. That is not how they come through. They come through by his effort. To him alone be the glory. Don't try to take things out of his hand. It won't end up well for you. So that's how this story ends. And so it's, very different than the stories that we've looked at up to this point, where things have turned out very well for Abram. This one has turned out quite poorly for Abram and for Israel, and particularly for Sarai, who this all began with. And the question, as we think to later chapters, chapter 17, 18, 19, the question here becomes this: who is Ishmael? Who is Ishmael? Is this the son? Is this the one God has promised? And we know that the answer is no, but don't miss that yet. That is yet to be determined. How is God going to address this birth of Ishmael? And what's God going to do in the coming chapters will reveal that to us. So there you have it. That's Genesis chapter 16.